August 8th, 1914. Dear Mother, when it was first rumored Canadians might be called for, I was keenly interested. When it was announced Thursday volunteers would be called for, I began to think seriously of what part I might play, whether I should stay at home and see many of my friends leaving, or whether I should join in with the others, or at least do my very best to join. I weighed both sides carefully. I fully realized the seriousness of the situation, but I cannot bear the thought of staying here. I've seen thousands of young men leave here, of only reading and hearing of things done when I might be in it all myself. I have been thinking of nothing else since Thursday. I have looked at all sides of the question from my own point of view and from others, and I came to one conclusion, that I would do my very best to be in it.
As Canada joined Britain in declaring war against Germany and its allies in August 1914, Canadians were in good spirits and ready to fight. Though not every Canadian man rushed to join up, what the public expected of a man was that he would fight for Canada and for the wider British Empire. To be a man in 1914 was to serve the war effort. Canadian society left very little room for exception. In Canada, a deep cultural union of militarism and manhood had been forged. The Canada that existed in 1914 celebrated militarism through parades and mock military battles. Young boys played with toy guns, while paramilitary organizations like cadets and scouts taught older boys how to shoot. Both society and parents hoped that learning this skill would teach boys how to be both a good soldier and a proper courageous man. Modern urban life was supposedly feminizing men and boys, making them soft. Militarism reflected a desire to return to the rugged, physical manliness that characterized the era of French and English settlement of the country. Many Canadians also believed that Canada could prove its worth within the British Empire through military contributions. Enlistment of men began immediately in August 1914. Recruitment posters further pushed men to join the war effort, and many of their images deepened the association between manhood and military service. From encouraging posters stating, "Here's your chance, it's men we want," to accusatory ones asking, "Your chums are fighting, why aren't you?" These posters communicated to men what society believed, that if they, as men, did not sign up for service, they were not doing their manly duty, and therefore were not the same quality of man as those who answered the call. Many who volunteered believed this too. Though the war was romanticized as a way to serve the empire, for many who enlisted, joining the war effort was about doing what was expected of them as men. As enlisted volunteers embarked from around the country, local crowds gathered and bid them heartfelt farewells. After only 1 month of enlistment, over 32,000 volunteers encamped at Valcartier, Quebec for training. Just 1 month after that, they set sail for England. Canada's men were going off to fight in the Great War.
3rd Company, 1st Trench Mortar Battery, 3rd Infantry Brigade, 1st Canadian Division, France. June 9th, 1916. Sweetheart mine, I suppose by this time you will have heard about the frightful time that the Canadians have had. I was all through it. Thank God I am alive today to tell the tale. My heart is very heavy. I have lost a host of good friends and comrades, some gone forever, some wounded, and some maimed for life. Such is war. As for narrow escapes, every man up there thought every moment would be his last. Not one of us expected to come out of it alive. 1 minute you would be talking to a man or giving an order, and before there was time to turn around, he was gone. Oh, it was a bitter time. All the furies of hell seemed to have been let loose with their most diabolical tortures to act both on the minds and the bodies of the men. There was no escape from it.
In order to serve as soldiers of Canada and of the British Empire, men on the front had to put their bodies at risk every single day. Canadian men who were able to write home during the First World War wanted to reassure family and friends that they still lived, because this war saw soldiers being killed on a mass scale. Between April 22nd and 24th, 1915, 1 in 3 Canadian soldiers at the Second Battle of Ypres were injured or killed. Canadian forces joined the Battle of the Somme in late August 1916, and more than 24,000 Canadians were killed, wounded, or missing by the offensive's end only 3 months later. Soldiers experienced this carnage firsthand and knew that to live through each day was not guaranteed. From the trenches of France and Belgium, seeing friends and comrades buried, mutilated, and decimated by the deafening downpour of shell fire and trench mortars, men expressed the belief that survival was a matter of either sheer luck or divine providence. To be a soldier, a man not only had to be fit enough to be accepted for service, but also had to engage his body in regimented training and drilling, then handle the absolute physical and mental exhaustion of being on the front lines. The First World War was fought in trenches, with each side winning back the same patch of ground repeatedly and few meaningful gains of territory. The futility of this process did not go unnoticed. As the war stretched on, many men recognized that it would not be a short affair, and that many soldiers would be killed because of it. The romantic notion of a glorious war fought by courageous, manly men shattered with each falling shell, damaged like the bodies of men unlucky enough to be in the line of fire or downwind from gas attacks. If even the most courageous or experienced soldier could be killed by the impersonal mechanized weapons of the First World War, no personal attributes or level of skill seemed to guarantee survival.
I've been under every kind of fire these months out here. Shells, coal boxes, shrapnel, pipsqueeze, whiz-bangs, rifle and machine gun, rifle grenades, bombs, minute-werfers, hand grenades, aeroplane bombs, and so forth. But give me anything except trench mortars and aerial torpedoes, especially at night. Sometimes you can see them at night, the fuse alight, but the fuse is only on one side of the projectile, and often you can't follow it, but only hear it coming.
Conditions on the front lines had men constantly on edge. A din of shell fire and the release of gases assaulted men's senses.
The stench from the gases was sickening. The eyes burned in water from tear shell fumes. The fearful explosions just a few feet away displaced the air with such force that each concussion seemed like a blow on the brain. We could do nothing, sitting there hunched up, our limbs cramped, our brains reeling with the never-ending shock upon shock, waiting for the expected one that would release us from this hell.
Complete physical and mental exhaustion, accompanied by heightened anxieties, manifested in shell shock in many. Men described the condition of shell shock among their peers with sympathy.
When I got back down the line to the old position, it was all torn up but one dugout, and 2 fellows were wounded and 1 shell-shocked. I thought I was due for that, but I didn't get it. I don't make any bones about saying I'm darn scared of shells, and anyone who says differently hasn't been there.
A man or officer who gets shell shock has all my sympathies, for that may come to anyone at any time, but I despise a coward.
Shell-shocked soldiers were acknowledged as complete physical wrecks in some cases, constant bombardment incapacitating men from even moving. Those who served at the front knew the horrors of endless shelling firsthand and differentiated shell-shocked men from cowards. Soldiers on the front had virtually no way to feel truly safe, and so apparent fear or inaction due to shell shock was not met with contempt. All men had to reckon with their mortality in the midst of the chaos and absolute hell of the front lines, and those suffering from shell shock were thought of not as unmanly, but human. Every man out there was trying to survive. In order for men to survive through the war would have to end, but the fighting seemed endless. Death in this environment, as many men observed, was not glorious. They had seen the damage done by gas attacks. They had seen comrades buried or blown to pieces by shell fire. They had seen the scale of destruction and knew that to die probably meant their bodies would not be returned home, if they could even be found.
There are so many that will always be classed among the missing that we shall never know what happened to them. There were so many attacks over such a large area that they're scattered everywhere. Such a great many were buried by shells filling in trenches and smashing down parapets that they will not all be found.
To get back home, men either had to survive or be sent back due to injury, and to be injured was a game of chance. While the overwhelming majority of injuries were accidental and acquired in the line of duty, a small number of soldiers made the choice to injure themselves in the hopes of leaving the tumult and violence of war behind. 25 of the Canadian men who made this choice were met with disciplinary action and executed by their own military, killed by their attempt to escape death on the front. No matter how it was acquired, an injury could be serious enough to kill, light enough to not affect ability to fight, or it could be just serious enough to send the surviving man away, either to a field hospital or across the channel to medical facilities in England.
Number 3, South General Hospital, Cowley Section, Oxford, England, June 17th, 1916. Dear Clara, as you can see by the above address, I have been transferred to England. Good old Blighty, the mecca of all soldiers at the front. In this beautiful old town on the Thames, this historical seat of learning, we have found a veritable haven of rest, ministered to by gentle nurses, our every wish and want granted. The grateful rest of soft beds and clean, cool sheets, the scent of flowers wafted through the open windows, the songs of birds, and above all, the peaceful quietness. After the turmoil and noise of battle, this indeed is heaven.
Amongst their comrades, and to their friends and family through letters home, men expressed the desire to get to Blighty. This desire seems at odds with the courageous, duty-bound, masculine military volunteer whom Canadian society idealized. Canadian soldiers did not think less of themselves as men for wanting to get to England by way of injury. Soldiers in the trenches of France and Belgium lived in a cultural space so removed from Canadian society that the meaning of manhood within their ranks shifted away from that idealized image to account for the horrific realities they faced daily. Volunteer soldiers who had spent time in the trenches defined themselves and their manhood against the men who did not fight, and those who had to be dragged overseas as conscripts when the Canadian government introduced the Military Service Act in late 1917. Those who had not answered the call willingly were the ones seen as less than.
I am proud to belong to the Canadian Army. They have proved themselves to be men. What will all those slackers at home have to say about this? I wonder what their feelings will be. The dirty cowards ought to be forced out here and put in the front line and kept there to take some of the punishment that their nobler brothers have had to go through.
There is only one thing can account for it. They have no patriotism, no manhood. To a true Canadian, the name conscript would mean everlasting disgrace, but I hope that those men may be found to bear it, and if they have any sense of shame, they will all realize the stigma which is attached to it.
Being willing to do one's manly duty and serve on the front was what made a proper man. Men's reactions to the conditions they faced in the trenches had less bearing on their manliness. Immobilized, shell-shocked soldiers were not seen as spineless cowards. To desire escape from the dangerous, deafening, exhausting conditions of the trenches was likewise not a failure of manhood. It was something many of these men had in common. Injury serious enough to get a man sent to England usually meant he would be unable to fight for at least a few months. Resting in a hospital bed, surrounded by the ambient buzz of nurses, doctors, and other patients, was comparably peaceful to the violent cacophony of the front lines. Of course, there was always danger that an injury could turn from just bad enough to an undesirable permanent disability, or might even be fatal. It was mostly chance that would determine the severity of an injury a man received. Still, blighties were more desirable than dying on the front, to be reduced to a body lost in the mud or otherwise unidentifiable. Men wrote to their loved ones about this desire in surprisingly light-hearted tones.
Of course, all the fellows are looking for good blighties this spring. You know what a blighty is, don't you, Mother? A nice little wound, just bad enough to get you over to a hospital in Blighty, England, for about 6 months. Next to going home, a blighty is the height of a soldier's desire, and no doubt there will be a good many this spring.
And they reckoned with the bleak reality of surviving the war, sometimes with humor.
It has its funny side, war. A man will be on the ground whimpering like a puppy in his agony, while his pal stands over him telling him how fortunate he is to have got such an excellent blighty.
To be injured enough to be sent to Blighty could even inspire joy.
I was examined by the doctor the next morning. He never said a word, but just looked at my papers and marked them England right away. Dearest, you can just imagine how I felt. I could have danced for joy.
This was a war full of senseless destruction and death, mostly caused by bombardment or machine gun fire, not face-to-face combat with the opponent. What defined manliness for Canadian soldiers was not the outdated image of the self-sacrificing, bold and brash, chivalrous hero of war. The simple act of serving on the front meant a man had done his bit. It didn't matter if he was injured and no longer serving, he had been there to do his part. To have been a willing soldier in France or Belgium, fighting against the Germans and their allies, was to embody manliness. From the beginning, Canadian society romanticized the war as an experience that could make boys into men, prove Canadian men's worth within the British Empire, and elevate Canada's esteem as a nation on the world stage. The price that the country would pay was nearly 66,000 dead and over 100,000 more injured or permanently disabled. The toll was a physical one. Faced daily with their own mortality, Canadian men reshaped society's idealized version of manhood amongst themselves to account for the horrific conditions they encountered during the war. All on the front sacrificed their physical safety to serve. The signs of existential crisis that came with serving under extremely violent, unpredictable conditions, such as shell shock or the contemplation of injuries as a way to escape, were not vilified as unmanly. They were accepted as the lived reality and humanity of men on the front lines of the First World War. Canadian soldiers recognized the desire to survive as human above all.
A fellow has just come in and is sitting at the table where I'm writing, who says he's going back to Canada, leaving tomorrow. How lucky! Wouldn't I like to be going with him? He's been out to the front and got a bullet just behind his ear, which has put him out of commission so far as fighting is concerned. There are bunches going out every day from this camp back to Canada. Just before they're loaded in the trucks that take them to the pier, they line up and the officers shake hands with each man. It is rather pathetic lineup sometimes. Many of them only have one leg or one arm. Some are disfigured in the face and nearly all are lame. But they are always cheerful, for they are going home.
Bye.